Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Jennifer Smith Maguire. I am a professor of cultural production and consumption at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK, and my day job is as Associate Dean for Research, Innovation, and Knowledge Exchange at Sheffield Hallam.
That's a mouthful, Jennifer, and I have to
Oh my
tell
God, and I stumbled over it. You told me to write my name down, and I should have written down my title.
well, I've got to tell you, the Marxist part of it was left out. So when you tried to say production, there was a cutout in the signal, so it was pro-tion, and then
Oh,
consumption
cool.
was all fine. That came
Well,
through just
I've
perfectly.
clearly coined a new phrase. So prosumption has suddenly been, accompanied by pro,
Blah, blah, blah,
and
blah.
yeah.
So apart from having, a longer title than the King of England, because he's got about 25 different
At least.
names, right? Charles,
Yeah.
Philip, Edward, blah, blah. What's on your mind today, Prof? What's
What's on
happening?
my mind today? Something far more prosaic than my very lengthy title. And in fact, if I throw in the title of the college in which I work, it does take a good 30 seconds and a full breath. Um, but no, it's Friday and it's the end of January. So I have to say my thoughts are turning to spring. I spent last weekend clearing out the garden of all of the brush and uncovering the new hellebores and the snowdrops and the shoots of the bluebells and whatnot. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow to continuing the work. And yeah, it's just, I love this time of year in the UK. Having grown up amid snowdrifts in Canada, this is what I love most about living here.
From snow drifts to snowdrops. And
Indeed.
which part of Britain are you in?
I'm in the Midlands, so I live in Loughborough, but I work in Sheffield, which is about 50 minutes north on the train. So in the space of a day, I will have rain to snow, cold to sort of sludgy fog. It's not the greatest time of year on the weather front, but as I say, the shoots of spring are very clear right now, and it's lovely.
And you've actually got some daylight at the time of day that we're talking. So that's a big sign, isn't it? When things,
Yeah,
instead of that thing of waking up when it's dark and getting home when it's dark. I went to school in Britain much of my life, and I didn't see the day for months because you started
exactly.
school when you would have had the same in Canada, of course. You start school when it's dark, and you get home from school when it's dark.
Yes. And I find, well, here is Uh, I mean, God, yeah, it really is dark. I remember walking home with the kids. We lived just down the street from where the kids went to school, and it'd be sort of 3:45, and you've got a kid on each hand, and it's dark, and you just think,
Yeah,
oh, like there's no
yeah,
respite from it. It really
sure.
wears you down.
And the other
Whereas
thing is,
now it's coming back.
you guys are right in the middle of England, not the middle of Britain, but right in the middle of England. I mean, there's a reason why it's called the Midlands.
Indeed. So rising sea levels have no purchase on us. We're right smack in the middle. Actually, I shouldn't say that. We've had some of the worst flooding in generations around where we live. We fortunately are on relatively high ground, but it has been a terrible stretch of flooding this year.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
I've read
although we're
about
in the
all
middle, we're
these.
in a bit of a swamp.
I've read about all these cricket grounds that are becoming unusable for sports because of climate change. Um, Specifically, Worcestershire is one of the top counties for cricket in Britain, and they've just been flooded and flooded and flooded and flooded and flooded.
Yeah.
Anyway, Prof, we're not here to talk about those things, though both of us find them interesting, and they are means whereby people who don't talk about football or about romance can speak to one another in Britain.
Weather and sport, agreed. Yes, indeed.
So tell us, I mean, now that you're in this position with many words, I imagine there isn't a lot of time for research. But is that something you can turn your hand to at all at the moment?
Yeah, it's the $10 million question or 10 million pound question. I've lived here for 20 plus years and I still haven't got my head to translate from dollars to pounds. Um, so I would say there are days, and to be honest, today was one of them where I can grab a chunk of time and turn my hand to my own research. At the moment, I am trying to wrap up the research handbook on the sociology of consumption, which is almost all complete. I've got a few last chapters to come in, and I'm starting to write the introduction for that. And that's brilliant. That's been a lifesaver in terms of having intellectual labor that is not about my day job. Having said that, I love my day job. We can talk about that if you want. But the research handbook is almost done, and that's been really fun. It's a collection of 40 plus chapters spanning the empirical diversity of how sociologists and sociology adjacent scholars study consumption in the round. So that's been fun. Um, and there is a kind of nugget of a book that I am working on very, very slowly, focused on the wine research that I've done for the last 15 years. But that is, I mean, if you think slow food is slow, my writing is slower than slow food. It's coming along. Sometime before I learn golf in my retirement, I'll finish it.
Well, let's go through some of those topics. But before we do, why don't we get into talking about being an associate dean?
Sure. It's I really love what I do. I like to think of it as I create the conditions through which other people get to do their research, innovation, and knowledge exchange. And that's incredibly rewarding. It's creative, can be very challenging. I don't know how familiar you are with the dumpster fire that is higher education sector in the UK, although the UK has no monopoly on financial unsustainability of higher education. That's pretty much worldwide. But it's challenging times, but it's incredibly rewarding to see how diverse my colleagues' work is, how it makes an impact on the real world. Sheffield Hallam is very much an applied university, and my college spans the business school, engineering and built environment, and computing and digital technologies. We've got food engineers, we've got people who focus on cybersecurity. It's like a candy shop if you're like me and you really have an abiding curiosity about what other people do in the world. It's great. It's very diverse, and I love that, but it does not leave much outside of the, I would say 9 to 5, although I'm lying, more like the 8 to 8 kind of job that is
Wow.
management. Yeah. But
And
that's okay.
when did you
A
start
bit of a
doing
work. About a year and a half ago, I moved into this role. And before that, I was the head of research for the business school at Sheffield Hallam. And in both cases, it felt like, not to go all Gwyneth Paltrow on you, but that sliding doors moment, where you think, had I made a different decision, I would have gone in a very different route with my life in terms of skill sets and industries, et cetera. And I have loved my career in academia, but it felt like an opportunity to have a very different stage of my career using very different skills. So yeah, it's been great. But it is definitely a challenge to juggle that and my own research, to go back to your original
and
question.
what about the impact of COVID-19 on people now, people when you started this job, and people when you were in the business school? What does that seem to have done in terms of faculty and also students?
Yeah, I mean, the impact of COVID, as you'll know, you're a historically oriented social scientist with a clear sense of a bigger picture than what is fetishized as new and now. But we won't know for a long time, I think, what the full impact of that is. I think that's the most obvious answer. Having said that, I can see a heightened attentiveness to what's missing in terms of a sense of community, which runs up against the challenge that people have become, let's say, more attached to hybrid ways of working, which makes sense of community difficult. So there's a sort of nostalgia for back in the old days when we were all together, paired with I don't really want to come onto campus all the time. Thank you very much. And I can say this, I mean, hand on heart, I probably get more done when I'm at home than on campus in terms of sort of cracking through work. But it is that notion of community. I think people have a better sense of what they I'll liken it to being Canadian. You have a better sense of being Canadian once you leave Canada. So you have a better sense of how much you value community, having lost that interpersonal time, I think, through COVID, which doesn't necessarily change the way you go about your daily life, but it heightens, I think, your attentiveness to when you stumble upon community, when you stumble upon human interaction, it somehow is heightened in its value. And that's a
Right.
wonderful thing where people are sort of a little more attuned to what's in it for them. But equally, you have this challenge of overcoming the digital whatever distanciation that we have in everyday life.
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
say that's definitely true of students as well. I don't think they've ever returned to the habit of engaging in person quite the same way.
Now, Prof, before we get on to consumption and the other topics,
Toby, call me Jen. You've known me for a very long time. You can't call me Prof. Nobody calls me Prof.
I want to ask you about something you just mentioned en passant, the C word, namely Canada. It was a very
Yeah,
interesting observation, your sense of having an understanding of your place of origin and growth that's different and perhaps richer since leaving. I mean, it's 25 years since you moved to New York, maybe from Canada,
yeah, more.
uh,
Yeah.
more. So tell me about how you're viewing Canada today. I should say parenthetically that for the first time in my life, I love Doug Ford because he's standing on this anti-Trump platform. These are words
Talk
I
about
thought I
a
would never say, right?
Yeah, I think we can agree that well, I mean that's the nature of context, isn't it? All of a sudden something else takes on a completely different meaning for you when he's the one standing out to Trump. Yeah, it's a bizarre idea of feeling Canadian when I have almost no connection to Canadian politics, Canadian context, Canadian challenges. I mean, for the years living here through the Boris fiasco and people going, "Oh, I hate Justin Trudeau." I'm like, how could you possibly hate your prime minister when he seems like a relatively reasonable guy and I have this dumpster fire on my doorstep? So, yeah, do I have any sense of being an informed Canadian? No. My sense of Canadianness is all in terms of its distance from what is my immediate environs. So when I moved to New York, very clear to me that I was a Canadian. Moving here, very clear to me that I was a Canadian, and what that means is always in sort of dialogue with what I'm not in terms of my local neighbors.
Yes, and I guess a lot of Canadians would speak that way as being, in a sense, the good Americans, contrast with the United States, but constantly having to define yourselves in relation there too. A bit less
Yeah,
for French Canada, a bit less for Indigenous Canadians, and a bit less for migrants. And those form a big part of the population, of course.
exactly.
But
Yeah,
there is this very strong sense. I mean, what people may not realize is that almost everybody in Canada lives within 50 miles of the border. And and in the days before cable and whatnot, everyone could watch US TV, right?
yeah, exactly. There that is true that most Canadians do reside, yes, within a relatively easy drive of the border, and frankly, not just sprinkled along the border, but in clusters. So, we're
Yeah.
not even um, evenly spread out. But I actually grew up in Northern Ontario, so I feel even perhaps more of a whatever extreme version. I mean, my dad's family was in the lumber business, so I've got like it's like a joke, like you've got a lumberjack in the family. You grew up in Northern Ontario. Like it's
But if we're in Southern Ontario, bits of it are south of the border, right? I mean,
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah,
someone like Windsor is in Michigan whilst being in Canada also, right?
yeah. It's interesting you mentioned about television because the assumption when I moved to in my own head when I moved to New York was that I knew all about American culture because of course I'd grown up on American television, and of course you very quickly realize that television has failed to convey certain other kinds of whatever. And of course, I moved to New York. It's not like I moved to other parts of the US. So there is no monolithic American culture, but I moved to a very particular kind of city with a very particular kind of culture that was um, very liberating, I think is the best way to say it. Just the whole sweep it under the carpet, waspy white Canadian background that I had, which was very much of a generational thing, got blown wide open, which was wonderful. It was best move of my life.
I don't know how you feel about this, but I get very annoyed with BBC people who've either spent 2 years of their lives living in DC or in New York now for 6 months, or Groniad reporters who pronounce on the United States. Um,
Yes.
because they, like you, have grown up thinking they understand this before they get there. and
Yeah.
in their case, rarely are really open because they're often mid-career professionals, whereas you were a grad student, right? Younger
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
perhaps a bit more open to newness, and pronounce on this country and on its politics in ways that are just monumentally stupid and ignorant.
Yep. Absolutely. The same is true, I would say, of the UK. I mean, what I love is the way in which its internal differences are much more surfaced and transparent in terms of where I live and where I work, as opposed to a kind of London-centric view of the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I was trying to think of who asked me the other day about how I was with, recognizing accents from different parts of the UK. I'm awful. I have no ear for accents whatsoever. Um, but it made me reflect on the Thomas the Tank Engine cartoons, the old ones that my kids grew up on, and that was my, very chunky stereotyped introduction to not just regional accents, but the regional stereotypes that characterize UK culture, so that you couldn't talk about UK culture. I'm not even sure you can talk about English culture, but there is a very London-centric notion of English culture or South-centric notion of English culture that tends to predominate. And my daily life tells me that's definitely not the case across the board.
Well, let's move on then to consumption, because that's part of what you're discussing really when you talk about television, when you talk about accents and where people are from and what counts as culture. This
Mm.
is consumption is such a complex topic. Uh, I mean, maybe you could take us through your view of it, but also what are the views you've tried to encompass in this fantastic sounding handbook project you just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of asked me to think about the introduction I'm trying to write, which
I'm
sort of
helping. I'm
oscillates.
helping.
Your help, yes, exactly. Except that I haven't quite got it all down on paper. So, well, thank God you're recording this. Maybe it'll be useful later. Um, I'm sort of oscillating between, and therefore I can imagine the introduction will have these two sections. But on the one hand, what does sociology offer to understanding consumption? So first and foremost, sociology helps us to step away from that ridiculous figure of the rational consumer, that sort of lone decision maker who's, got whatever their needs and their wants and their budget, and they're making these rational decisions.
Mm,
And not only does that help it, us to blow apart that model of a rational economic actor and bring in affect and social relations and social context and habit and all the rest of it, but it also helps us to look beyond consumption, this sort of fetishizing of shopping or of buying, and to look much more broadly at, a consumer culture is a culture in which the fundamental values, practices, modes of belief, et cetera, are shaped by these notions of individual sovereignty, which is a myth, but this notion of individual sovereignty, I have choice, the privileging of hedonic pleasure, the notion that, the efficacy of the market, no matter what's wrong with me, I know I can buy a solution, all these sorts of deep-seated myths and beliefs, and how they shape not just shopping, but they shape how we think about parenting, or the way we choose our educational options, or the way that we think about our national identity. So, when do I feel Canadian? When I'm bringing home maple syrup back to the UK as
mhm,
presents for friends.
mm,
So on the one hand, I think consumption offers sociology, or rather the other way around, sociology offers consumption a way to think about this as a set of processes beyond just an individual point of purchase, to see the sort of big picture of how our ways of thinking of the world have been shaped by these myths of um, pleasure, of use, of choice, etc. But the flip side of that, I think, and this is the bit that I was sort of wrestling with this morning, is because I also think that consumption offers sociology something really powerful. Um, and I've taught sociology of consumption in different ways over the course of the years. And every time, you start with, in the classroom, you say to students, how many of you have professional experience with advertising, or how many of you are marketers? And of course, they're undergraduate students. They don't have that expertise. But then you say, right, how many of you are wearing brands? How many of you have done a review? How many of you have recommended something to others? And there's this way in which their everyday expertise in consumer culture, because it is the milieu for all of them on the day-to-day basis, allows them a sense of purchase on what can be really quite a dry, theoretically driven discipline to go, right, these are the tools for helping you to figure out what's going on in your daily life. So I've found consumption just to be a brilliant starting point for getting people to think sociologically. That was a very long-winded answer. Toby, make sure I write it all down. That'll be the introduction. There's 1,000 words right there.
You did say you managed to get the word production over the ether that time, so
Did oh good.
we're in progress. We're in process. I wonder if I could throw out a name to you, Barbara Kruger. And I'm thinking of maybe in the 80s, the postcard she made that said, I shop, therefore I am.
Therefore, I am. I used that as a slide when I taught advertising for years. And I was, you'd get this whole discussion going about what do we mean by this and what are the implications and
Well,
the downside.
and right. And I'm popping her next to Kant, and Kant saying in What is Enlightenment that it must involve people freeing themselves from all sorts of things, and
Mm,
somewhat implicitly, somewhat explicitly, that included God and purchasing. And then there's a line, a feminist line that became very important, as you know, in the 80s in particular, of shopping therapy, but
yeah.
also of trying to get away from a hyper-masculinist focused on production, traditional Marxism, and one that would denounce all sorts of women's pleasures, whether they be melodrama or clothes, right? And
Yeah.
trying to resuscitate these things and give them a value. And I saw Kruger, and still do, as riding those rails very effectively and powerfully. And I wondered about your, in a sense, political economic view of consumption, because this question is also long-winded, but it is going to come to a close. I'm
I'm
thinking of the
paying
way
attention.
in which corporate environmental criminals like BP popularized the idea of a personal carbon footprint as a means of making individual consumers responsible for the climate crisis, when in fact they have very little to do with it. So I just wanted those
Yeah.
thoughts to lead you into, in a sense, what's your take? Does it have to be good, bad? Is that not the right question? Do we need to be binary about consumption?
Short answer is yeah, we don't need to be binary. I think the longer-winded answer, just to pick up on one bit, which I think was really important in the development of the sociology of consumption as a legitimate domain of research, was around pushing back against the hyper-masculine version of economic action,
Hmm.
and of what was a worthy focus of study, for instance. So to make the study of teenage magazines and households and cooking, et cetera, for those to be understood in a really fundamental way as culture in the classic cultural studies way of pushing against elite culture as a whatever a monopoly claim on what counts. Having said all of that, I think the sociology of consumption and more broadly sociology of valuation, market studies, et cetera, has come an awful long way in having a more well-rounded, holistic understanding of cultural production and consumption as two sides of the same coin. And I think that's really fundamental. Although it's, the research handbook on the sociology of consumption, it is also about the cultural production of consumption. So there's frontline service workers, there's advertising, there's the actual making of stuff, and for that matter, the ongoing revaluing of stuff through secondhand markets, et cetera. So consumption, to my mind, and obviously the handbook reflects what I'm interested in. That's the beautiful thing about doing projects like that. But
Mm.
is this attempt to get at the whole world of how stuff and relations and services are made and remade and what's embedded in them. So consumption really is a medium as opposed to the object of study. To go to the more fundamental question, is it good or is it bad? I am a pragmatic person. So if this is the system we've got, And it's not monolithically the system we've got. It looks different if you are in Laos, or if you're in Paris, or if you're in Vanuatu, or wherever. I mean, it's not the same everywhere. Nevertheless, for large swathes of um, Western consumer culture, this is the system we've got. And if we hang on to the myth of that individual consumer, that rational choice actor, the one who's got the individual carbon footprint or has the individual shopping list, etc., then we fundamentally fail to understand ourselves as social individuals. And a lot of the work that I do around wine um, is around people's understanding of themselves as social individuals, as not individual, of being deeply interconnected with their natural world, with other people around the world, as well as locally. And if you want to have, if we desire, not just desire, frankly, we desperately need a system of production, of distribution of wealth, frankly, redistribution of wealth, if we really want and desperately need that system, we have to have dispositions and mindsets that understand that as better and as natural, as not as something not to be questioned, but to be taken for granted, in the same way that we currently take the individual as taken for granted, as something that is unquestioned. And we're not individuals. There's nothing about us that is autonomous in that sort of cut off, closed human sort of way. But that's the narrative we live with, and it prevents us from living in a more just, connected, sustainable way. Wow, I didn't think I'd end up there, but that's there you go.
You mentioned wine. Tell us about that and how that's become part of your research and the work you've done on it.
Um, Well, for anybody out there listening who is wondering whatever will become of their PhD topic, I can tell you you'll end up doing something completely different eventually. So I started when you first met me, when I was living in New York, my PhD research was around commercial fitness cultures. So how do health clubs and personal trainers and fitness magazines, et cetera, how do they make us view purposive exercise inside on a exercycle, for example, as something that's a useful and good and desirable use of our time and our energy, et cetera. So how does it create the value of working out in a way that makes sense to people? And when I finished my PhD, I totally burned out on the topic and I was just sick and tired of it and I needed something else. And I was at dinner and we had friends around and the wife was talking about, I hadn't met her before, and I was just trying to get to know her. And she was talking about the work that she did with the wine industry, and it was fascinating. And as she was talking, so not only am I trying desperately to pay attention, ask good questions, because you want to make a good impression on somebody you've not met before, who's married to somebody who's a friend of your husband. You're just, you're trying to click. And it just went from that to, oh my God, tell me everything that you do. And I think I'm doing my first interview of what's going to be my next research topic. Like the light bulb went off in the course of dinner. So I took the same theoretical interests in how value gets constructed, the cultural production of these fields of consumption, and it pivoted from commercial fitness to wine. And the rest, as they say, is history. I milked every friend I had who had connections in the wine industry to say, who have you got that I can talk to? And I just started a very self-serving exploratory phase to sort of figure out what I thought might be interesting. And it took off from there. It ended up focusing, as it turns out, on small scale wineries, which then narrowed further to those who engaged in biodynamic and natural and organic winemaking practices. And that's been the focus for the last 15 years or so. Less so, obviously, in the last 2 years, because my day job, as I refer to it, has kind of taken over. But that will eventually be the book.
Now, wine and fitness, I guess you put them together, you get witness, but they're somewhat antithetical, perhaps, in that one is meant to be about health, the other is meant to be more about decadence or culture or something. I mean, are there links versus differences there?
I would say so. It's not something I've spent a lot of time thinking through, although actually the commonalities between the sociology of wine and the sociology of fitness or physical culture, I have actually thought quite a bit about. Both run the risk of being these strange little subdisciplines that people make snarky comments about. Um, but in terms of what animates my interest in both of them is
Mm.
from the point of view, and I'll park my research on fitness and actually just think about my own engagement with physical culture. There is a demonstrable sense of vitality in being physically active. And that doesn't require running around. I mean, there's just something about kinesthetic awareness, about engagement in the world that can be satisfied through gardening, is where that's where most of my physical activity takes place. Equally, it could be about, running or jumping up and down or what have you. But there is a sense of lived materiality in physical motion that is arguably more prized because our daily lives tend to be sedentary. So there's a sort of marked contrast. And in the same way, I have heard through these interviews with winemakers, wine writers, wine retailers, etc. And again, my own, we won't call it autoethnography, just my lived experience as a consumer. There is this material engagement with the physical world, with
Mm.
the
Mhm.
I don't want to say natural world because that fetishizes it as if it's separate from culture, but an engagement that is real and meaningful and allows people a genuine sense of being in place, of being alive. And that's the stuff that I find really fascinating. I think my sociology has probably transitioned increasingly towards philosophy. Having said that, that's, I think, the sociological question that I'm interested in is how do people
Right.
experience the conditions of human flourishing through some of these activities? So
And
is it
that's an obvious
consumption? Is
link.
it the market? Yeah, sure, but it's not just that.
So, what are some of the theoretical and methodological things you do? I don't want this to sound like a job interview, but that sort of question can appear like that. But I think it would be interesting for people to know, or at least it's interesting for me to know a bit more about the, the ways of going about this that influence you.
Yeah, I mean the methodologically, I am a qualitative researcher by and large. I It's a lot of immersing myself in the life world of the other, not taken to the extreme of an anthropological ethnography, but interviews, field work, engagement or immersion in the kind of media sphere in terms of the text produced, the images, et cetera, but how they're engaged with. So it's sort of like how does all of that create a world in which some things, some values, some practices come to be taken for granted. And you have to do that by trying to step into the shoes of those who are participating. Um, so that's, I guess, the easy undergraduate year one answer to methodology. The, you go hang out and you try to understand it from their point of view. Theoretically, become I have long been interested in and found incredibly useful Pierre Bourdieu's work. If you study consumption, everybody cites Distinction, this massive doorstop of a book that he's got, which is wonderful, and it's written in kind of circles and vignettes, and it's a wonderful piece of work, but it has sort of eclipsed the rest of his work, I think, for sociologists who study consumption. And part of the work that I find particularly useful, like the his work on habitus and outline of a theory of practice, links up very much with Norbert Elias's work on the human condition, on understanding individuals as social individuals, thinking about social relations as figurations, etc. So those two, Bourdieu and Elias, have really become the touchstones, I guess, for the work that I've been trying to do, trying to think through understanding the way in which these market actors, in the case of wine, understand, perceive, value, engage with these weird kind of wines, and trying to put that in the context of something more than just wine consumption. And at the same time, it sort of leads me down all sorts of other great routes. There's, wonderful stuff in new materialism. There's super stuff in science and technology studies and et cetera, et cetera. There's plenty to read on the theoretical front, but it's yeah, fundamentally guided by that question of not unpacking, rethinking how we might feel as humans outside of that individual actor to see ourselves as uh, interconnected, fundamentally interconnected humans.
So the title for your book after this one is Unpacking Wine. Nice
I
trope.
like that. Nice play on there. Yep.
Now, although he's immensely influential in Europe, Elias has never really cracked the US sociological world
Yeah.
for all sorts of reasons, I guess. But, and that is still where most sociologists in the world live. So, do you find that you need to explain the use of Elias where you don't need to explain the use of Bourdieu?
Yes, well, yes and no, because of course, when you say Bourdieu, people go straight to distinction. You have to sort of remind them that it's that
Yes.
there is another or not another Bourdieu, but there is more to Bourdieu than distinction.
Well, his
But
fieldwork
having said that,
in North
what's
Africa,
that?
his fieldwork in North Africa is
Yeah,
absolutely crucial. Mhm.
yeah, absolutely. So in terms of Elias, yep, my self-serving chapter in the handbook is a use of Elias. And I say, here's an underutilized theoretical figure. Here's somebody you might want to play with if you are thinking about studying consumption or frankly anything else. But you're right, he's underutilized. I think there are sort of um, Cole's notes stereotypes about what his work is and isn't about. So I remember sitting in a meeting with a colleague, this is years ago at the University of Leicester, and the colleague sort of flippantly said, "Oh, well, Elias has no theory of power." And I was like, "Well, have you ever read him? Because if you think it's all about handkerchiefs and table manners, then chances are you haven't got a clue what you're talking about. It's all about power. It's all about human interaction and human interdependencies." So there is, there's a sociology of knowledge there in terms of what happens when you're ahead of your game and you're not translated into English and. But when you read Foucault or when you read Bourdieu, you are reading the impact of someone like Elias on how we think about human process and for that matter, think processually. Equally, Deleuze and Guattari, or Bruno Latour, you're reading this same kind of approach. And rather than fetishize something that's published in 1980 or 2025, why not read Elias? Because it's amazing. You read and he's like just just beautifully crafted ways of thinking about humans that really challenge our assumptions about what is the use of theory and language. It's good. I love it. Plus, I'm a theory nerd. Like, I always loved that bit about grad school.
It's one of the sad things, I think, about British academia that the higher education world that you went through in Canada and the United States, with its coursework as well as thesis emphasis, really broadens people's thinking, whereas the British model narrows it very often. Doesn't have to, but very often
Yeah.
does.
Yeah. That
So
was the best part of my PhD. We had two modules, classes, courses, whatever you want to call them, that were required. There were others, but these were the two best ones. One was classic theory and one was contemporary theory. And you got in really deep and dirty with the detail, and you had reading groups and debating. I mean, why on else, I would never in any other situation know Nicholas Luhmann, but I had to spend 2 weeks really thinking through Luhmann and debating. I may never use him again, but having thought through that, then you get to think differently about other theoretical takes on the world. Anyway, that depth of theoretical engagement, I don't know if it still exists in sociology because I'm a sociologist without ever having done a sociology degree. I didn't do my undergraduate in sociology, which was probably a saving grace. I came to sociology as a teaching assistant and in my master's, and then did my PhD in a sociology department. So I came to it at that point, like having it as the here's the treasure box of theories, as opposed to getting bludgeoned with chapter after chapter about structure and stratification, etc. So I think I don't know if that still exists in sociology, but if it does, then that is a wonderful way in which that discipline protects and fosters and continues the tradition of rich theoretical thinking. Because having worked in a business school for a very long time, I know that there are business students who do their PhDs and are drawing on the same stuff, but haven't got that approach to disciplinary socialization, into the ways of thinking, into ways of reading and thinking till it hurts.
Now, a couple of your other books are about food,
Mm.
including, I think, a recent one.
Which bridges Elias and food.
Okay, so I have to confess, I haven't read that book. I don't have a copy of it. Could you give me, to use your expression, the Coles Notes or the Hallmark card version?
I can. It's only just come out. In fact, I only had the hard copy arrive
Oh,
like a
exciting.
week,
Hold it up. Hold it
a
up.
week or two ago. There we go. It's got a
Exciting.
very anodyne green and
Oh,
yellow
yeah,
cover,
no,
but
that's
it is.
sexy. That's, Jacqueline Suzanne, Danielle Steele title right
Oh,
there.
nice.
Yeah.
So, towards an Eliasian understanding of food in the 21st century, established foundations and new directions, which I co-edited with John Lever, was really the driving force, and he was very kind to invite me along, and then Adriana Caput-Goodridge. And it's a wonderful collection because it is genuinely global in its empirical contents. It is genuinely historical in terms of looking back to, ancient times right through to thinking ahead into the very uncertain futures for food, and is hugely diverse in terms of the way in which Elias informs those chapters. So, my chapter is going to be talking about sociology, is studying the, norms of or the problems of interdependence, and Elias's twin concepts of homo clausus and homines aperte. But equally, you've got stuff in there that's about like the grand notion of civilizing processes, functional democratization, established outsiders, so on and so forth. So it's a wonderful way, given your comment earlier about Elias not being a well or not somebody who necessarily people have engaged with a lot. It's a wonderful way to get a tasting menu of all of these different ways in which to read Elias through what is really quite an accessible um, empirical area, which is the study of food and food cultures.
Mm. What are some of the big issues in food at the moment? Food sovereignty, food security, food health.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Well, I think anybody who's walked down the supermarket and tried to understand labels and tried to make choices that match rising food prices with health concerns, with shrinking budgets, et cetera, will know that, yeah, you've just named the key concerns in terms of food in the 21st century. Where does it come from? Can we make enough of it to feed all of us? Can we make it in a way that doesn't kill us? Because frankly, ultra processed foods might be cheap and tasty, but we have pretty good evidence that they're part of the epidemic of morbidity that's facing most Western populations. Um, so yeah, we have massive systemic challenges around the quality of food, the equality of access to food and of food choice. Um, and of course, it gets caught up, as you mentioned, food security gets caught up in geopolitical challenges. I mean, the war in Ukraine is absolutely driving some of the sharp end of the stick for some people engaging on a daily basis with how do the heat or eat crisis. I haven't got enough food, so do I heat the house or do I eat? And the really shocking levels of food poverty within what are ostensibly, that I am using scare quotes here, developed nations.
Mm,
So
mm,
yeah, huge, huge challenges. And then right from the, massive systemic challenges right through to the everyday experience of how do I trust where something comes from when I've seen, X, Y, and Z in the news about food adulteration or whatever supply chains breaking down and having no consistency, and so a huge crisis of trust married with consumer desires for authenticity and small scale stories, etc. So it's a big, messy domain, and therefore, as befits my interest in consumption, I find it interesting as a domain in which to use sociological tools because it is big, it is messy, it is interconnected.
And to give anthropology its due, it's always been regarded as a core element because of its necessarily crucial aspects to ritual,
Yeah,
to religion,
yeah.
to the nexus of production and consumption, to personal and especially collective meaning.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like, when I talk about reading and I get all nerded out and I'm like constantly writing notes in margins that have like decades now of notes in them, Mary Douglas is like that. I mean, you can't read Mary Douglas without just getting caught up in what a brilliant way to frame what seem like everyday mundane matters and then to take you beyond that to go, this is the making of culture. So yeah, she's not that it's all about Mary Douglas, but bless her, she was awesome.
Purity and danger, inter alia. Now, I want one last question I'd like to ask you, if I may, Prof. Jen, and then throw it over to you to add or subtract anything
Okay.
as a means of concluding, if that's okay. At the moment, I'm in Mexico, which over the last 20 years has gone from producing horrible wine to really wonderful wine. And I know that in China, they've been importing people from California and from France to get them to be able to make wine that people will like. One of the things you've looked at is wine production in Britain.
Yep.
One wouldn't have thought of it as the best climate, but I'm not an expert. Can you tell us about what's being done in wine production in the somewhat less hospitable zones of the world for such things?
Yes. Well, it's interesting you say that because, of course, some of the most well-established, esteemed areas in the world for growing wine are becoming inhospitable because of climate destabilization. So we have, this is, partly my long-term interest in how forms of cultural legitimacy are produced and changed is that climate destabilization fundamentally disrupts established notions of what is and is not a good area for growing wine. And by good, I mean in terms of if you're a viticulturalist, right, this is an area with enough, rainfall and sunshine, et cetera, but also good in terms of cultural cachet. So, the historic moment of assuming that old world wines from France were necessarily better than new world wines from Australia is long gone. Get my little note there about Australia, but equally the notion that we know where we can grow wine has been disrupted.
Mm. Mhm.
So those two things interact when you talk about British wine. So in the south of the United Kingdom, in say Kent and Sussex, you have those two notions of good. So on the one hand, good, you have um, appropriate growing conditions, soil conditions, et cetera, for growing good wine. But you hadn't, until relatively recently, had any purchase on the notion of good as in cultural legitimacy. So it was like, oh, who's ever going to drink English sparkling wine? That's crap. And now, of course, you have English sparkling wine competing and winning against its French counterparts in international wine competitions. It's not made at a scale that would allow it to compete on the supermarket shelves. It's much more expensive. But in terms of quality, in terms of being good for agriculture and good in terms of connoisseurial evaluations, et cetera, those two things are coming together. So when you mention inhospitable, what I'm thinking of is Yorkshire. That's where I work. And that's where my interest is. How do we further challenge this notion of what counts as good in terms of cultural legitimacy for wine areas that are only going to be useful for cold hardy varietals? So, for instance, the Bacchus grape, Madeleine Angevine, et cetera. These are grapes that aren't what we have as established notions of noble grapes of good winemaking, and yet make some wonderful wines, but also wines that can be grown in their environment. So from the point of view of environmental sustainability, that's no bad thing. To challenge notions of what counts as good in terms of legitimacy, to be able to diversify agriculture. Now, obviously, viticulture is a very strange niche part of agriculture, but I do think there are some related, let's say, lessons that might be taken out more broadly in terms of agriculture. But you asked, about what's going on in terms of English wine. And you mentioned Mexican wine. I think what's fascinating to me is that wine is not just being made around the world. Wine has long been made in countries around the world, but it's being recognized for its possibility of being good in that cultural legitimacy sense, not just because we have, let's pat ourselves on the back. Oh, we've got a much more democratic notion of what counts as good. It's not just French wine. I shouldn't say I love French wine, but it's not just French wine. It's, anybody can make good wine. It's not that only some people get to be part of that club. But that happens at the same time that people have become, this goes back to, the question about COVID, people have become much more passionate about seeking out provenance stories that offer some sense of authentic connection to place, something beyond just this is wine that could be from anywhere. They want a story in a glass. They want to connect with something that comes from a place. And when I say they, of course, I am talking about a niche of wine consumers. There is also a vast audience of wine consumers who are looking for a beverage, and I happen to be one of them on, 5 nights of the week. But every once in a while, when you want to spring for the theme park version of wine, which tends to be more expensive, you're looking for something that is beyond the everyday, has some sense of, I don't know, that sparkle of place. So I think there's a huge diversity in the what is considered legitimate wine now because of those multiple factors. Climate destabilization changes where we can grow wine, quest for authenticity and a connection to provenance and place,
Mm.
and the global diaspora of wine expertise. That means that whoever is making wine near you in Mexico probably has some training that reflects a global standard in terms of quality.
Wonderful. I feel as I've learned so much in the last hour chatting to you. But tell me, there are other things that I haven't learned yet that I should learn. Is there anything we have failed to touch on that you'd like to mention? We didn't talk about your
Oh,
work on intermediation, for example. Is there anything you'd like to
yeah.
add?
Oh, my list of things that I find really interesting, of course, is very long. You mentioned cultural intermediaries, but I think the thing that makes me most interested about cultural intermediaries historically and to this day is their role in shaping those stories about where things come from and being the conduit for them. And that's really the interest I have with wine, I think, is that it's the stories that attend to it that allow wine that is very small, made in a tiny little place and somewhere that maybe no one's thought of before as a place that wine comes from. Those stories allow it to travel. But it's in sharing those stories and in having one's sense of self and interconnectedness affirmed through those stories that I think is really fascinating. So again, to go back to earlier in the conversation, it's not just consumption. This is about human life and trying to identify opportunities where humans can flourish with each other, with the natural world. As I mentioned, I have ended up studying natural biodynamic and organic wine by and large, and the notion of working with the non-human actors, about engaging with other species with bigger notions of time, etc. These things are tangible and real for people who are engaging with this kind of winemaking, and that's exciting to me because it means that there is a crucible in which we might figure out how to be better humans and have a nice glass while we're doing it.
Well, Jennifer Smith Maguire, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure.
Thanks, Toby.